Hi all, this is just a quick recap of what I covered in lecture about the type of data to use for your plant phenology experiments. So depending on the type of hypothesis that you proposed, it will determine what type of data you will use. For example, if your hypothesis is about the intensity or how much of a leaf cover or how much of a canopy cover is a certain color or any of those characteristics that you guys measured, if it's just intensity at a particular point in time, then you'll use the data from last week. If you go to the D2L page, you'll see you can access the data from the news feed. You can go to the content page and also access the phenology data under lab course information, and it's right here. So you can click on that and then you can download that plant phenology data. So let me download that real quick. So here's that data. Now let's say that your hypothesis was what we have listed here, right? So that if you've got non-green canopy cover in a native species, greater than non-green canopy cover in invasive species. So let's say that maybe that's the dependent variable that you're measuring. So then we would look at our class data, and you want to look at non-green leaf color. And what you can do is, for depending on your invasive and your native species, you can look at this information here and determine, all right, from this one compared to another species, what's the average percentage of canopy cover for that one. So if you find that in the invasive species there's more or there's less non-green leaf color present, then you can think about how that might result in invasive species outcompeting native species. Now, if for some reason your hypothesis is about the time of year that a particular phenophase is observed, so you're comparing the time of year that colored leaves are observed in one type of plant versus another, then you're going to need to use the National Phenology Network data. And the way to access that data is you'll need to go, again, back to the D2L page, and if you go to the home or the content page, there's a link to the National Phenology Network. So if you click on that link, that'll take you to where you can download phenology data. So I would read through some of this information here just to make sure you're doing what you should be doing before you start collecting data. So once you're ready to collect data and you know which phenophases for which plants you want to look up, then you'll go to download data, and that'll bring up this portal. And what you can do is on this side here, depending on your screen, it might be at the bottom, it'll sort of give you an idea for how many records you might be looking at. So for us, we're interested in this intensity data. So phenophase status of different phenophases and intensity in which they were expressed. So make sure you click on status and intensity. The date range, that's up to you. So let's say you want to look at the last 3 years, then you'd select the last 3 years. But just for an example, we'll do for the last year. So we'll go back to November 2015, and then we'll select today. So we'll set the date, and as you can see, they're updating the record, and it's probably going to show millions of records. There we go, 2.2 million. Now location, we're interested primarily in southern Appalachia. So what you can do is you can zoom in on the map, and let's zoom out a little bit. And so any area that's in this particular map area will be selected in terms of location. So make sure you hit set location. Sorry about that, I got a phone call. Alright, so make sure that the area in here is the area that you want to select and that you set location. Then you're going to go to species. So this is where you might want to look up your invasive species and your native species. So the example I gave in class was the multiflora rose. So we select our multiflora rose, we set our species, and then phenophases. So you'll have in mind which phenophases you want to look at. And so in this case, I want to look at leaves. So I'll set my phenophase. And then ancillary data, just in case you want some more information, you can get that about the individual plants, but you don't have to do that. And then once you're ready, you'll see we're down to 1,500 records, and now we will finish. Make sure you acknowledge that you've read the data use, and you might actually want to read it, and then download. So it's going to automatically download a zip file. So if you don't have something, you'll need to be able to unzip that file. You can contact ITS if you're having difficulty getting the files unzipped. And what you want to get is the observation data. All right. So click on observation data. And if we go back again to our hypothesis, and what our dependent variable was, is what we're looking at colored leaves among native and invasive species. And right now I have our invasive species chosen. So at this point, what you can do is, if I am looking at these particular leaf characters and I want to look at colored leaves, so it's not increasing leaf size, it's not falling leaves, it's not leaves are present, but colored leaves. So for all of my entries for colored leaves, what I can do is, in this column here, this Q column, that is the day of the year. Okay, so this is the day of year that particular phenophase is observed, and I want to determine the average day of year that colored leaves are observed. So in this case, what I can do is I can select all the values for colored leaves. All right. And if you notice in Excel, down here at the bottom of the spreadsheet, it'll show you how many items are there, and it'll also show you the average. So in this instance, for multiflora rose, the average day of year that colored leaves are observed is the 185th day of the year. So for one of your data points, you would have 185.28. So in this case, what we can do, if we know that that's the information, we've got 185.28. All right, that's for our multiflora rose. Here, let's do this the other way around. And that's our invasive species. And this is our day of year colored leaves are observed. Okay, and so then you would pick your native species. So let's say that we pick the Cornus florida, the dogwood, as our native species. You could go back and look at that information, and let's say after you've gotten the average, it turns out that the day of year that colored leaves are observed in the dogwood is like 198 days into the year. Okay, and I'm just making this data up. So in that case, what you can do is you can graph this data, because Excel is just one wonderful thing that you can use, and we can insert a graph that shows the difference. So here we see that our multiflora rose versus our dogwood, in this case, the time of year, the day of year that colored leaves are observed for the dogwood is much later than for our invasive species. So now this tells us that in this case, our colored leaves are observed later in the year for our native species versus our multiflora rose. So in this case, if our hypothesis is that the colored leaves are observed sooner in our native species, then that hypothesis would not be supported. You will want to put in axes and all that kind of stuff, and axes labels in here. But this is information that you'll use to support or refute or not support your hypothesis. So that'll give you an idea of what your graph should look like. Don't forget that you've got that lab report is due next Tuesday. If you have any other questions about how to use the National Phenology Network data, just send me an email. And if you have problems with downloading the files and accessing those, that would be a question for Information Technology Services. So you can just Google ETSU's ITS services, and they'll be able to help you. And don't forget that you'll need to submit that lab report to the Dropbox. So make sure it's submitted there by November 8th, next Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. Again, if you have questions, feel free to email me, and hopefully this video is helpful.